Let's do this. So first, thank you so much to all our panelists who have joined us today. It's my honor to host one more panel on our series of regional highlights of the based on the Network Readiness Index 2020. And it's wonderful to welcome all the attendees that have joined us today. So my name is Carolina Rossini, and I am the founding CEO of Portulans Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank based in DC with collaborators in Geneva and Toronto. And I'm a lawyer, has a background, but I have over 20 years of policy and management experience in the ICT sector and the telco sector. Portulans is a young organization founded at the end of 2019 with Bruno Lunvin and Professor Sumitra Dutta. And our mission includes informing stakeholders by producing independent, rigorous, metric-based research, such as the NRI. And you can learn more about us and our programs, including fellowship opportunities at portulaninstitute.org. So today is an honor to host this regional spotlight on Europe in cooperation with UNESCO and also ICANN in Europe. Our 2-hour-long event is divided in 2 segments. The first segment is focused on dialogue with the panelists here present, around the topics of digital transformation and building forward better, especially in this COVID and post-COVID era. During the second segment, my colleague, Dr. Bruno Lunvin, will present the recently released Network Readiness Index, which we launched on October 19, with the key findings for Europe. And we will follow that presentation with some reactions from our panelists. So, and I also want to thank STL, who has sent Ankit as a representative here today for being the 2020 knowledge partner for NRI. So a couple of quick housekeeping issues. We will have opportunity for a Q&A, you should use the Q&A function of Zoom, not the chat Zoom, because through the Q&A, the panelists can address you directly. We encourage you to identify yourself and identify the panelists you would like to respond to your question. And we also encourage our attendants and panelists to share your comments online. You can follow us, you can follow the Portulans Institute on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and we will be live tweeting this session today, and you can follow the hashtag NRI 2020 and digital transformation. So please, I would ask the panelists to mute themselves while others answers, and I'm just gonna jump to some of the introductions. So Ankit Agrawal, sorry, I'm not sure if I pronounce your name, your surname correctly, is the CEO of Connectivity Solutions Business at the STL Group. He joined STL in 2007 and heads global sales for telco products. Under his leadership, he has expanded STL global footprint and successfully managed joint ventures in China and Brazil, where I come from, actually, Brazil. Ankit has had a well-renowned career in corporate strategy and strategic transactions on an international level. Welcome, Ankit. Dr. Jacques Bogan is a global thought leader in digital transformation and innovation. Currently, Jacques is a professor at Solway Business School, where he teaches business strategy. He also sits in our Portulans Board of Advisors. Thank you, Jacques. And prior to this, Jacques was a director at McKinsey Brussels office and co-led the Digital Economy Initiative. Jacques has led a variety of global research efforts on economic trends like globalization, inclusion, inclusive growth, and impact of tech on society. Thanks for joining us, Jacques. Paul Hofheinz is the co-founder and president of the Lisbon Council, an independent and non-partisan think tank based in Brussels. In addition to this, Paul has served as a regional strategic advisor for economic and tech policy, and most recently, he became a member of the European AI Alliance at the European Commission. Paul often speaks at BBC, Bloomberg, and CNBC to offer his analysis on innovation and the future of work in the European context. So thank you for joining us today, Paul. And Dr. Bruno Lunvin is a director and co-founder of Portulans Institute. He's also the co-author and co-founder of the Network Readiness Index, the Global Innovation Index, and the Global Talent and Competitiveness Index. Bruno serves as the INSEAD's Executive Director for Global Indexes and is the president of the Smart City Observatory. Bruno has a long career working in ICT development and innovation in institutional roles. And he was a senior advisor for ICT and government issues at the World Bank and was the head of electronic commerce at the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Thank you, Bruno, for joining us. Last but not least, my dear friend and mentor, Chris Mondini. He is the Vice President for Stakeholder Engagement and Management Director of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, in Europe. Chris started his career as a US diplomat and became a corporate investigator for Deloitte, investigating some of the world's largest corporate corruption cases. Chris has also worked with NGOs like the Full Circle Fund, a philanthropy organization addressing challenges in economic development. Thank you, Chris, for joining us and for the partnership in putting this event together. So let's just move on to our panel and questions today. So I would like to start with Jax. Is it already clear, Jax, that the pandemic will exacerbate global inequalities? While millions have moved their lives online, over 3 billion people remain disconnected. This has a disproportionate impact on women and girls especially, and historically marginalized communities, particularly those in the global south, but also in Europe if we think about the increasing number of refugees we see in the region. In which ways has the crisis exacerbated digital divide? And looking ahead, how might we leverage digital tools such as reskilling to close it? I would ask you to keep your comments to 3 or 4 minutes the most.
Thanks, Carolina. I guess I'm going to make 3 points, and I will elaborate on each of them in 2 or 3 minutes.
Jax, do you mind turning on your camera?
Can you hear me? Okay. I wanted to make 3 small points, and I will elaborate on them in 2 or 3 minutes. As you described, digital divide has been a theme that has been used quite extensively, and I think to frame the discussion here in terms of not digital device as a pure access, but especially in the context of usage. The second point is about the crisis, the pandemics, where we stand at this stage. I think the question is that there is an exacerbation indeed in terms of what I will call the digital divide use, but at the same time, there is an acceleration of digitization. So we need to look at both aspects of the equations. And last but not least, and I think is the most important point, which by the way is your question at the end, which is what can we do to accelerate the digital divide to be much smaller, and what's the scaling approach that we can take? If I take these 3 points together, here's a bit of the picture that is emerging. As I say, the digital divide today is still a bit about access. I think a lot of people, as you say, are not yet having access to the device. But frankly, in the last 10 years, we have seen a lot of deployment, especially because of the mobile device versus the PC-centric device, that has allowed a lot of people to access. We're still far away from having people accessing this, but at least we see quite some improvement. Where I'm afraid we haven't seen a lot of deployments is in the usage. At the end of the day, one of the major bottlenecks is not access per se, but a lot of people are still very scared about how to use the digital technologies as a way to connect, to do business, and you name it. And last but not least, the digital use today is usually measured from a consumer point of view, but at the end of the day, where the economic values seems to be centralized is obviously in the context of digital transformation within enterprise, because it's how the enterprise basically creates the added value, the GDP of a country. And there as well, what we see from the digital transformation is that US, Europe are definitely ahead of the rest of the game, but Africa and a lot of the developing countries are still far away from having a process of digital transformation that spill over to all the enterprise, especially the small medium enterprise. On the second question, which is the statement about, what about COVID? Now, what COVID has done, it's a good thing in one way, which is that if the enterprise digitalization was still very small in terms of usage, today we have no choice but to use access technologies like today we're doing with Zoom as a way to connect to each other. And in fact, replacing the social interactivity or the exchange that we have in marketplace through obviously digital technology. So in one way, this kind of one-off event, hopefully is going to be a one-off, has basically created this potential for even more digitization and creating fascinating way to connect to each other. Still, the digital divide has increased because, again, a lot of people don't have access to the PC. At the same time, what is very nagging about this crisis is that it adopts a lot of divides or element of fears and worries. There is obviously the health element where most people will not have a way to be trace, track, or basically connect to people. There is obviously the fact that if you happen to be a poor individual, you're likely to be in a job that requires still physical interaction. Otherwise, the job will always be automated. And that means that the fear of going to work and be exposed to the virus is higher. And last but not least, it could be that the financial crisis, especially coming out of the wave 2 of what we find out today from the pandemic, can exacerbate obviously the divide. So this is a point where indeed the digital divide is there. What's the solution? But whatever happens, I think the key point is the skilling. And as we know, not only you need skills to use the digital tools, but I also believe that digital implies that you need to have different skills than just purely digital. It's likely to be much more interactive like we do today in terms of and creativity, because automation will not basically take that away. And the good news and the optimistic view, I want to stop on that on the skilling side, is that today a lot of these platforms, if they are accessible though, like Coursera and the like, create an opportunity to democratize education. And platforms even like YouTube, the largest consumed videos on YouTube are how-to type of video, which means that the helping hand of these technologies, with Coursera and the like, can create a major opportunities for people to tap into skill and learning on by example. This is a fascinating opportunities, and I hope that this will be part of the digital divide to be closed.
Thank you so much, Jax, for that. Chris, coming to you. Europe has always been a global leader in digital transformation and innovation. Indeed, as Bruno will soon show us later on during the NRI presentation, the Network Readiness Index top ranking economies are European: Sweden, Denmark, and Netherlands. Many economists recognize that meaningful inclusion and diversity in governance and firms alike is key for innovation and competitiveness. How do you think how we could leverage this unique moment of digital transformation to rebuild more inclusive, diverse economies in a post-COVID world?
First, I want to say thank you very much to Portulans and for the invitation and for your work. I'm sitting here in Europe, and my role with ICANN, the coordinating body for the Internet's addressing systems, is to explain how it works and develop advocates and participants from among the stakeholders who are affected by our work. And one of the tools I use to do that is good news about the global internet, good news about digital transformation. And I will say in recent years, there's actually demonstrably less content that I can use to start the dialogue off about the positive effects of the internet on economic growth, health outcomes, innovation, entrepreneurship, educational advancement, etc. So I'm delighted by the work that Portulans is doing and a big advocate, and why we're very proud to be a partner with you here. When COVID came along, we were given another talking point in a way, because of course, suddenly the internet and connectivity became mission critical to everything that we're doing. We're all digital all the time. And ICANN has actually published some interesting studies on the performance of the web, the domain name system, and internet traffic over this period. And spoiler alert, I will tell you, it's a very resilient and well-functioning system, even in a work from home around the world environment. But it's sad in a way that this pandemic is a talking point about the value of digitalization and connectivity. So your question about strategies and what we can do really touches at the heart of what ICANN is struggling with in many ways right now, and that is inclusion and a diversity of voices. The internet's a global resource, and we want global participation in its governance and direction. And normally, as you know, as Bruno knows well, and anybody who's participated in ICANN, we normally organize our work around 3 very open, free public meetings in a different city of the world 3 times a year, where anywhere between 1,000 or 3,000 people of all categories show up to sit in committees and make standards and policies about the internet addressing system. It's a challenge in having gone virtual is really, on the one hand, you would never expect that we're suffering from a challenge because we've just completed our 69th public meeting. It was virtually held in Hamburg, and we had nearly 1,800 participants from 157 countries in 95 sessions. And so you would think that it's working, we have inclusion, we've reached our stakeholders. But in fact, it's clear that the active participants, the voices that are coming to make comments, to participate in the chat, to ask questions, they are not as diverse, and we have fewer newcomers. So whereas in a physical environment, it's easier to help newcomers overcome the complexity, the jargon, the technical background information, when we're with them in a place like Kuala Lumpur or Panama City or Johannesburg, we just can't do it in this virtual setting. And so to get to the concrete approaches that we're trying, it echoes very much, I think, what Jacques was mentioning. On the one hand, getting people connected. So we established a fund for our stakeholders in parts of the world where connectivity is either very expensive or very unstable, so they could increase the quality of their connection. We did very structured role-playing exercises. We've doubled the amount of content on our online learning on how to participate and how the internet and its addressing system works. And finally, we've started a dialogue across the whole community talking about how we can be more strategic and less reactive, particularly if this COVID pandemic persists for a long time to come. So I hope those are a few ideas that might, in the ICANN context, be translated into some of the policymaking European context that we're discussing. So thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. I love and I completely support this idea of being more strategic than reactive. I think we all always should be thinking that way because we have the year of 2020 has proven with COVID and assessing bees and agriculture crisis in the global south that we all gonna still have to do with a lot of environmental and other crises. So being prepared for that and supporting community is going to be essential. So thank you so much for those examples and best practices from the ICANN community. Paul, if I may ask you to come back with your video. So I have a question for you. The digital leadership has been put under strain during the pandemic, but it's clear that countries with a robust digital infrastructure and which are highly inclusive and empower digital governance strategy seem to be better equipped to handle the pandemic's fallout. We saw that just yesterday during the Latin America panel when we discussed briefly the case of Costa Rica, that at least in the beginning of the pandemic was really being able to organize its citizens through a lot of e-government and e-participation, for example. So in your experience, Paul, what does good digital leadership look like? What digital leadership do we need to make sure that no one is left behind the curve of digital progress?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Carolina. Is my camera back on?
Not yet. Oh, there.
Okay. It won't let me do it. Here we go. Hello. Listen, thank you for the question, and I can only join Chris in thanking you for this extremely interesting study, which gives us so much evidence to ponder. I think good policy making always starts from there, and that's a partial answer to your question, is start with the facts. Look, your question was about what good digital leadership looks like, and maybe before we talk about the digital part, we talk about leadership. I think there are two elements that have to be there in all successful leadership, and one of them is rhetorical advantage. You have to have good arguments that are convincing, that people are ready to go along with, that feel true and authentic to them. And you also have to have programs that deliver on those things. Quite often people can have persuasive arguments with lousy programs behind them. And sometimes they have good programs with not such persuasive arguments on top of them. The successful leadership comes from combining the two, along with the conviction to make things happen in the real world. Now, I'll jump ahead to this question of digital, and maybe we look a little bit at recent developments in the European Union. The policy, certainly of the last 18 months, the von der Leyen administration has been about reestablishing digital sovereignty. It's the phrase they use. I think it's maybe not a terrible concept. I understand why people are thinking that. Europe in many ways has been left behind by the digital revolution. We certainly have a gap at the corporate level in the companies from here that are producing the kinds of services. We've seen the US and even China surge ahead in that and haven't developed equivalent companies here, despite a plethora of good ideas. We have outstanding research in science. No one has ever questioned our prowess in that area. The question is why we don't get it out of the laboratory and into people's hands in the form of goods and services that they want and need to consume. So they more or less put the right issue on the table. I'm worried that maybe they haven't put the right program behind it. And there, quite a few of the ideas have centered around things like, well, what essentially boils down to data localization, that we will use our European data to drive European businesses here. I'm not opposed to that, but the problem is if that were all it took, the most successful digital country in the world would probably be the Democratic Republic of Congo, because that's where they have the most raw materials that are used in digital equipment. Whatever it is that's going to take to succeed is going to have to go a bit beyond that, and it's going to have to deliver success on the level of services, essentially, of goods and services, of providing the best products, the best services at the right price that people have the most confidence in. Trust, very important in this, and that they want to use. And until we do that, until we can deliver that, we won't have digital sovereignty here. Now, jumping ahead, there's another matter I'm concerned about, and it touches on what we're discussing here today, which is the digital divide within Europe. We have an enormous one. Quite often people think the digital divide is between developed and undeveloped world, but right here in Europe, we have all of the extremes that you could possibly imagine. The Scandinavian countries' use of the internet is something like 97 or 98%, which is phenomenal. I mean, that means absolutely everyone can go on the internet and do something. But in our worst countries, our worst performing countries, it's under 50%. And I'm sorry to say the particularly shocking news is that one of those worst performing countries is Italy, which is, as we know, a member of the G8. I mean, that's really not acceptable for a country of that size and age to have 50% of its population unable to go online. Now, the reason I mention this is not just an ethical or moral reasons, although we could have an ethical and moral discussion about what this means, but just seen from a practical point of view, how on earth is Europe going to have digital sovereignty? How are we going to succeed if half of our population is unable to use the internet? So we've been arguing for a couple of years that this is a strategic matter that requires a strategic response. And to go back to my original formula of rhetoric and program, the rhetoric we put on the table was every European digital. Very easy to understand. And we need to put a program behind it. And the the central problem I see, and I'll stop in just a moment, is that in some ways what we're talking about right now, it's too easy to agree on this. I've been to 10,000 conferences where we've talked about digital skills, and I'll bet everyone else speaking today and listening today has as well. And the problem is we all agree that it's a problem, and then we move on. We need to move beyond that. We need to move to putting a proper program behind this, a hard program, not a soft one, not another skills alliance, although those are fine, there's nothing against them. But let's put some EU money, some EU budget, and some policy priority and some attention at the highest level behind that vision of every European digital. And I have to think that good things would happen, both to Europe as a competitive environment, but also to the lives of individuals, particularly in these times of pandemic, when access to online for pretty much everything, not just meetings like this, but digital services moving online, has become so crucial. It's very important that we make progress in this area. And thank you for the chance to speak about it today.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I think that ties really well with the idea of leadership that we were also tackling with Chris before. We see many countries, especially when there are government changes, an abandonment of national strategic plans, right? Something that really holds the whole system together, right? Like lots of countries nowadays, which amazes me, don't even have a broadband plan anymore. So I couldn't agree more that we need a narrative for society, but we also need this strong narrative. I think Bruno can comment on that later, but I think one of the countries, I think was South Korea, actually has put a bunch of those things in their constitution. So you have some, over the years, stability for that governance system. Okay, so, and Ankit, coming to you now. So you come from the telco industry, right? So in the telcos industry, now that digital transformation has transformed from an initiative to an imperative, for companies of every size, and doesn't matter where they are, what changes in operations and priorities have you witnessed among some key ICT stakeholders in the private sector? Perhaps you can comment on this in the concept of COVID-related services, and especially when relates to some potentially marginalized communities, please. I know it's a lot of topics in one question.
Thank you, Carolina. And again, I'd like to appreciate the Portulans Institute for inviting STL and for inviting me to speak. Just a quick background of STL and interest for everyone. We are a technology network solutions provider. We're working with governments, service providers, internet service providers globally in more than 100 countries. And so my experience is, and what I'll touch on is, just working in these variety of countries. While we're headquartered in India, we really do serve telecom operators globally, and I think we've been fortunate enough to also operate. We have our operations, also physical manufacturing sites across India, China, Brazil, Italy. So we also have some experience of working in those ecosystems as well. I think one of the very important things to look at when we talked about access a little bit time earlier is also the cost of that access. And I think I just want to share some data points here. Some of the African countries today are spending somewhere between $28 to $30 per GB for getting their data. That is somewhere in the range of around $8 to $10 for the US, Canada, and some parts of Europe. And just to give that in context, in India, we're paying about 10 cents per GB. So that's the magnitude of cost that you have to pay. And it's pretty incredible today in India, for example. People may not be aware, we are now the world's highest data consumer. Where rest of the world, even in China, they're consuming about 10 GB per month. India is already at close to 16 GB per month. So just by nature of really, really low cost data, it's become ubiquitous, so to speak. And at the same time, the handset prices have fallen tremendously for 4G to sub $100, significantly sub $100. We're at $50 now in India. So I think a combination of this and some reasonable network, it's still not, great 4G, but even decent 4G is enabling this kind of explosion of digitization in India, that we're seeing. I think, coming to your, question, I think very specifically, linked to, COVID, I think clearly the stakeholders, I would say, starting from the government, have clearly understood that the need to make tremendous network modifications and upgradations are important. And this is not just an India story. We're seeing this in all parts of Asia. We're seeing this in parts of Africa. We're seeing this across Europe, and even, for example, in the US, they have now the RDOF fund, which is a $20 billion fund to essentially build out rural broadband. And the government will directly fund the remotest parts of the US to bring broadband to them. In India as well, we have close to a $10 to $15 billion fund to connect every village. In fact, our Prime Minister has just announced that 600,000 villages of India will now be connected with high-speed fiber-based broadband. So clearly, I think the government is clearly making this a priority because it has become such a significant driver of our productivity that we talked about a little bit earlier. So I think that's one very important stakeholder. On the other side, I think the telecom operators and the service providers are having to almost double down on their network investment. We're seeing this across the board. One example I can talk about is, for example, in the UK, the government is willing to invest close to 20 billion pounds over the next few years to significantly increase the broadband connectivity. We clearly see, at least in terms of broadband connectivity, these three countries in Europe are lagging behind, which are mainly Italy, Germany, and the UK. They're significantly behind in terms of their broadband connectivity. And exactly these three countries are now doubling down, so to speak, in terms of broadband investment. I think the other stakeholders which are coming to the table are the so-called, on one side, the OTT providers, but also the services. So people are coming up with new innovative ways to go beyond access. I think that's what was touched earlier by Jacques, is that we have to go beyond access to ensure that the impact is actually happening. I would say two examples, I would like to give. One is that we're seeing a tremendous surge of online education. Today in India, one company, which is just a startup called Byju's, is now the world's most valuable education ed tech company. And probably no one's heard of them. And they're worth more than $10 billion. All of that has happened and got accelerated just through this almost as a COVID response, where children now cannot go to school and parents need support to teach their young children. So that's clearly a very significant growing space. At the same time, we're seeing telemedicine also rapidly expand in India and globally. We're seeing this in the US and Europe as well, where people want to have certain levels of medical advice from their homes. And we're seeing some tremendous companies capture that value and provide great service to citizens across the age groups. So I think these are various stakeholders that are coming to the table. I'm personally very excited being part of this industry, because I feel this kind of transformation is very live, is very now, but I also feel this will take 5 to 10 years to build out. So I think that's in summary the opportunity that lies ahead, but clearly I think there are exciting times ahead.
Thank you, Ankit, so much for that contribution and that perspective from the private sector. So Bruno, if I may come to you now, after releasing the 2020 Network Index results, what governance should we be looking at right now for best practices of digital transformation, especially to fight COVID?
Thank you, Carolina. I think we've heard from our panelists already some very important points. So let me react to them and in this way answer your question. When Chris reminds us of what underpins the internet, I'm reminded of the time. I was very privileged when I was a member of the board of ICANN, because our chairman at the time was Steve Crocker, one of the initiator and inventors of the internet. You may have seen this famous picture with the three founders, Vint Cerf, John Postel, and Steve Crocker. And Steve, in our board meetings, always reminded us constantly that internet and connectivity have become so much part of our lives that we tend to forget that it relies on an infrastructure, a physical infrastructure, and it relies on a regulatory infrastructure, basically how you assign names and you make the network work. Today, with the COVID crisis, we are reminded of these physical realities. And what Ankit just told us goes in that direction. That is, if you don't look at the prices of devices, of terminal, you're not doing your job in terms of resolving digital divides and inequalities. So it is very important not to lose that dimension in looking at network readiness rankings and digital transformation. This is why we introduced, and I will say a word of that later on, the notion of trust as one of the key components in the new version of NRI. Then the points that Paul mentioned about leadership are critically important. Are we still online? Okay, so the point there is that leadership, whether it is in the public or private sector context, has an even more critical role to play in COVID times. And personally, I'm very enthusiastic about the signals we received from the EU recovery package presented by President Ursula von der Leyen. 750 billion euros is not a small amount. And the fact that the package is oriented around two themes, number one is green, number two is digital, is a very good leadership signal, which is a long-term signal. So in that way, again, Europe may also be showing us the way. Jacques mentioned the importance of working with SMEs, with working with the industrial structures. In the end, I think we would all agree that the reason why we're talking digital transformation is threefold. We're looking at jobs, we're looking at younger generations, and we're looking at reducing inequalities. These are the main three challenges ahead of us, and this is where digital transformation should take us. And there's one common point to the solutions to these three areas: jobs, younger generation, and reducing inequalities, which is reskilling. It is all about education. It is all about empowering individuals, organizations to generate the benefits we can expect from digital transformation. So I'm very encouraged by the signals we have received from the panelists. I would add one layer, which may be a footnote to all of that, which is that we're entering a new age when, so to speak, we start to know what we are talking about. I think that it is fair to say that for a number of years, there's been a high level of confusion between digital transformation and digital initiatives. To explain that, I will use a simple comparison and we'll stop at that. When we move from a physical world to a digital world, we have to learn a new language. And when you learn a foreign language, there are two ways to practice it. There's the wrong way and the right way. The wrong way is to try to translate every single word from your own native language into the new language. And that doesn't sound right. It doesn't work right. The proper way is to start thinking in the other language. If you are French speaking natively and you want to speak English, you won't be able to do that until you start thinking in English. This is a challenge we have ahead of us for digital transformation. We need the people and the organizations who have been used to working in a physical environment to think in a digital environment. And this is the true digital transformation. So let's not assume that if we translate our payroll, our marketing, our purchase functions into digital environments, we are going to do digital transformation. I think the world has realized that. COVID has helped accelerate the process. And now what we need to do is just to implement it. That sounds easy, but it's not.
It definitely is not. Thank you, Bruno, so much for that guidance and also to point out what actually is relevant for a real digital transformation. So, Jax, if I can come back to you. So you have written at length about the digital divide, especially in infrastructure and talent. So how does COVID expose or exacerbate this divide, especially the talent one? And more importantly, what do you foresee as the consequences of this divide for Europe after COVID?
Yeah, there are two questions in what you asked, but I want to piggyback on what Bruno has tried to synthesize on what we have said, which is at the end of the day, the theme is indeed digital transformation. And I want to re-emphasize that in the digital divide, the question is not access or usage per se, it's really whether the usage is sufficiently transformative such that, as Bruno said, it creates a new world where job opportunities are bigger, the young can benefit from that, and the inequality, whatever, and the way it's measured, is actually declining. And in fact, what these technologies do, especially when we think about the cloud technologies and the AI and so on, is that they give us a potential to rethink radically different ways of how we operate and the way we do business. And I think this is the theme where digital is fundamentally important. It's not the technology per se, which is a bottleneck. It's indeed a bottleneck because you need to understand how to translate in word and in practice how to use it. But the fundamental element is not to do it for an optimization point of view, but much more from a transformational point of view. And why do I say that? Is that today, the companies that today, when we look at the digital divide, we come to the conclusion indeed that Italy is not there yet in Europe, for instance, versus Scandinavian countries. But even in Scandinavia, what is more important is that the number of companies or people that can use the internet from a transformation point of view versus a pure optimization or basic usage point of view is actually quite rare. And in fact, what we see is that we see a large digital device, not on the have and the have not, but on the ones that can transform and the ones that cannot transform using these technologies. And it comes back to your second question, which is, if I look at what makes a great transformation to digital and what does that imply because of COVID and inequality, is that at the end of the day, why don't we see so much impact these days from digital per se? Because it takes time not only to have a full global usage, but because transformation takes time because it's all about complementary assets, practice, and competence. And these complements are usually having people who basically have the skills, not the digital skills, but the new skills and the new workflow to work with these technologies. Possibly have the capital to scale that correctly. And at the end of the day, that will create the end game or the new game of digital divide. If you take again India, I love what Ankit was saying, but the fundamental point is that India, 20 years ago, had a fundamental rethinking of its industrial policy to move into the outsourcing IT/ITS industry, and today is basically by far the global leader in the IT/ITS industry. And as today, independent of its education system and the innovation he has done in e-commerce, it is possibly 60 to 70% of the digital talent pool that we need, where we don't have enough in the world. So it is today a fundamental number one type of complementary asset that can help him to glue back and become very convergent and benefit from the digital capability. So it's come back to that fundamental question, which is with COVID is a catalyzer because it will help people to use much more interface from the digital side. But what is missing is that in that context of those new tools, do we have a way to accelerate the skill deployment? Do we have a way to get the organization to embrace and change radically the business model? And here's an interesting point. If you look at education today, either people don't have access to education or people have access to an old model of education. And the model of education whereby you can be even a PhD or an engineer by going to school until 25 years old is likely to become an obsolete model because you learn much more on the job, you learn by doing, you learn by crowdsourcing, you learn by cooperating, and actually you are in a stage of constant learning because the versatility of these technologies help to redefine new type of business model. And I think where the NRI is obviously moving into is not only to move for the governance on the trust and the like, but I also believe there is a call for the education system not only to be accessible, but to be redefined and redeployed and retransformed to make sure that it's actually a much better complement to the technologies such that at the end of the day, we can fill the job, young, lower inequality equation that Bruno was referring to.
Thank you, Jax. I think that does give us good pointers for the years to come, especially on the training, the talent. Chris, if I may come back to you. So this year has brought to the fore a host of policy challenges to creating a sustainable, inclusive, and safe internet ecosystem. One of the things we also discuss in a couple of the other regional spotlights is the issue of trust and cybersecurity. You see that actually the cybersecurity risks increasing, the trust decreasing in COVID in a moment that we all need to be online. So drawing on your experiences at ICANN, what further policy changes are necessary for European countries to reap the benefits of the digital future dealing with these challenges?
Thanks again for the question. And I'm just really stimulated by all of the responses to date. And I think that we're all complementing each other and weaving the themes together rather well. From the perspective of ICANN and the work I'm responsible for, I am really, when it comes to talking to policymakers or regulators, I have a sort of a first do no harm approach. As Bruno said, I'm really engaged with helping raise awareness about the infrastructure, the underpinnings of what makes the internet work. Really simple stuff, really, that people don't know, that it's not a unified global network. It's actually tens of thousands of independent autonomous networks that join together voluntarily because they use the same standards and the same addressing system. And also that the data travel across these networks in very diffuse ways. And then finally, to this issue of the ecosystem and the trust relationships that keep it all going. So the ecosystem also includes, to people's surprise, the private sector and volunteer organizations and governments and organizations, I would say, even like yours, that advance knowledge in these areas. So the ecosystem hasn't changed very much, but it is really crucial for the advances that everyone on this call has been talking about. And so ICANN, in my role, I try to be a voice for that ecosystem. We never comment on national policies or regulations or legal law proposals. Instead, we'll explain what the impact might occur on the ecosystem or on the technical underpinnings. We might look for clarification on laws and how they affect the workings of the internet, again, which I'm very focused on. With regard to Europe and the region that we're in, I have to say, I find that they are rather good at putting people at the center of their policy decisions. And as the NRI demonstrates, these conversations can't happen without the recognition that people are very interstitially involved in all of these complex relationships. The internet runs on people, and even though we talk about artificial intelligence or the Internet of Things or automation, they're still in the service of people, and they still emerge from decisions by people. And when looking, I would love if somebody decides to do a more rigorous analysis, but I looked at the rankings that we'll talk about in a moment. And then I took a glance at the 2020 World Happiness Index. And as people may know, the World Happiness Index looks not just at well-being, but the feeling of well-being, i.e. the happiness of citizens from country to country. And guess what? The top 10 of the World Happiness Index and the top 10 of the Network Readiness Index are very similar. And in fact, 6 of the countries are absolutely identical. So if you're asking me what policy recommendations I have for reaping the benefits of a digital future in Europe, I would say to European policymakers, well, do more of the same. And, you know, Paul talked about every European digital. Well, so just by that, it's the European, it's the person that's at the front. So, you know, in a multi-stakeholder environment like ICANN, you really become accustomed to recognizing good decisions come out of a balanced view of government, of private sector, of users in civil society, and the subject matter experts, the technical experts. And, you know, there's a caricature about countries like the US being a little bit too focused on the private sector solutions, and maybe countries like China having very governmental-led solutions. But, you know, I think that's why a lot of the world looks to Europe. I think because of this perspective of citizens and societies. And I have to say, I have tremendous respect if you can forge consensus or decisions among 27 very diverse member states, then those outcomes must be resilient and somewhat inclusive. Not to say that there aren't huge challenges and a lot of work in the details, but I don't have a lot of advice for beyond what's already been mentioned by my fellow panelists for what policymakers should try.
Thank you, Chris, for that. And it was very interesting when we were renewing and revising the model of the NRI in 2019, that we also look at that because it's such an important part to understand how people actually benefits from technology. Looking at technology as a medium and not as an end in itself. And I saw all the panelists shaking their heads in agreement with you when you were making your comments. So Paul, you were the ones that it seems to be agreeing with Chris on this. So it would be great to hear your reactions, but also I have a follow-up question for you. So while there is so much optimism about the promise of digital transformation for European economies, our economic outlooks are not optimistic in the slightest. What are the main challenges you see to European competitiveness in the years ahead, and how digital transformation can support overcome these challenges?
Am I back in the meeting now? Okay, thank you very much. Caroline, I think the first answer to your question, I think, is pretty obvious to all of us, which is COVID-19. This is obviously a very big problem, and we probably don't need to spend a lot of time talking about it, but I would say this, when you're in the middle of a hurricane, it's often difficult to imagine that sunny days will come again, but I do think they will come again. The question is when. You know, 18 months in the history of this planet is a blip, but in the life of a person, in the life of a society, it's a very long time. So we're in some ways racing the clock. I think when it does come back, we as a human species will be smarter than we are now, because I think this crisis has taught us a lot. And one of the things it's taught us is that we ignore the planet and the reality of the ecosystem we live in at our peril. We were doing an awful lot of that before this virus reminded us again that we are living beings in an ecosystem that's very fragile. The message of sustainability will be back. The imperative of public health will be much stronger. And what happens in every crisis, it always accelerates the trends that you saw going into it. And the world will be more digital at the end of this too. I wanted to go back and maybe address 2 points briefly in this discussion. And one of them is maybe to introduce a concept that some of my friends here in Brussels at ESI created about what they call digital endowment. They wrote a lovely paper a couple of years ago where they looked at this idea of infrastructure and essentially said that it has 2 components. You can have the pipes, the tubes, the routers, and even the regulatory environment that I think Bruno and others have mentioned. But you need the human capital along with it. And that when we think about digital infrastructure, we should think about human capital as part of that infrastructure too. And that's a little bit what I was trying to say earlier, was that we absolutely should think about it. But to be honest, I'm sick of thinking about it. What we really should do is do something about it. We should put this as a policy priority. And by the way, Bruno, you mentioned the European budget and the initiatives that the Commission has taken. One of the points of wrangling, and this hasn't gotten much attention, but the European Parliament is trying to increase the amount of money going into digital skills. There are a couple of initiatives underway on that right now, which we have broadly supported. Actually, what we'd support would be that they get a deal out because this is meant to be a counter-cyclical package, and at this rate, they risk missing the cycle entirely. We'd like to see it back, but we wouldn't be upset if it included a stronger digital component than the one, in particular, digital skills component. There's been a long, lengthy, exhausting, sometimes constructive, sometimes destructive argument about transfers, essentially about whether the north of Europe should transfer money to the south. And what we always say to the north is, if you're serious about Europe, it's going to have to happen in one shape or form, and let it happen on the matter of skills, because you have the resources and you need to use those resources to get the South up to speed on the digital economy for moral reasons, but also for very hard, concrete, and sound economic reasons. So that would be the main thing that I would want to say. That, and you're about to see how old school I am. The European Union began as a coal and steel community, and I actually think the internal market is a very important part of any future digital strategy. We're still way too divided on that. We don't have anything like the economy of scale that the North Americans have. And by the way, anyone who thinks that the secret to success is cutting regulation, well, go out to California and have a look at what happens there. It's the most regulated economy you will ever see. So that's not why the entrepreneurs are going there. They're going there for a different reason, because there's access to capital. And when you hit it big, my God, there's 330 million Americans ready to pile into whatever it is that you produce. And we've been unable to create that dynamic here in Europe. And I don't think we'll solve this problem until the day we do. And my main concern is that it's kind of even disappeared as a policy priority or a point of consideration. They need to complete the internal market, give our entrepreneurs a bigger, better, and easier place to succeed, so they won't all run off to North America like Spotify did, and then come back in a few years later as a multinational.
Thank you, Paul, so much for those contributions. So just to close our panel today and move forward to the NRI presentation, Ankit, again, from a private sector perspective, there is a clear necessity for reskilling and upskilling. One of the interviews we did during the digital transformation dialogue was with Stefanini, which is a multinational company from Brazil. And it's very interesting to see how much upskilling and reskilling they are doing, but also because they feel they have a great opportunity now to access talent anywhere. So drawing on the STL experience during the pandemic, what are some of the best practice that maybe you guys develop or that you are seeing in other companies that you can share with our colleagues in Europe?
Sure. So I think one of the critical themes, I think, have been around the reskilling and reinventing your skill sets for the work environment. I think that's further got accelerated by the COVID. I think on a psychological level, a lot of people are rethinking about their work, about what impact it has, and I think that's especially prevalent for the younger generation, where they're no longer just working for a salary. They're much more importantly looking for a purpose, looking for something significant to contribute to society as an important driver. So I think one of the very interesting statistics I came across was that IBM actually about 45% of the open positions that it has does not require a four-year degree. And a lot of those positions are for software application development, etc., as you may believe. So clearly, I think the traditional educational metrics will become less and less relevant. It will be much more of a gig economy where people may have multiple jobs during a particular day, or may switch as on an hourly basis. So I think that is rapidly accelerating now, and I think, as you mentioned, the whole job environment is also extremely global now. Where for example, today we've done away with almost 60 to 70% of our office space globally, and a large portion of our employees are working remotely. But that comes with its own challenges. Working remotely is not easy in its own way. And even being skilled to just be able to work efficiently remotely itself is something that's extremely important now more than ever. I think I just wanted to share an example of what we experienced. So one of the things that we touched on earlier was, how do you get access? So we've been working with the government in India to provide broadband fiber connectivity to close to about 8 of India, taking the fiber to the villages. What we realized is that less than 1% or 2% of that bandwidth was actually being utilized because while you took the broadband to the villages, they just didn't have either the knowledge or the capability or the skill sets to utilize that bandwidth effectively. So then what we went about doing is, as a pilot now in 10 villages, we've actually set up these digital kiosks. And then on top of that, installed a local village level entrepreneur who knows how to use these kiosks. And now that has enabled the entire villagers to use this platform for medicine, for telemedicine. They're too scared to go to the cities to talk to doctors because of COVID. So now they're very happy doing this on this kiosk. For all the children can't go to schools anymore. The teachers aren't coming to the villages, but through this kiosk now they're talking and learning with their teachers. All the government programs they are not aware of for the agriculture, and that they're seeing through this kiosk. But it was possible because we had this village level entrepreneur, and we had the infrastructure, and we had a physical medium like the kiosk to make this happen. So I think that is a combination of multiple things. This person now who's skilled can then go and skill probably 50 or 100 more people, but you have to set up this ecosystem to make this happen. So I think that's one example which I find is linked to this whole digital transformation theme. I think overall, clearly, while my example was for in India, we see this globally where there's also automation happening, AI happening, robotics happening. While I'm not a kind of doomsday believer that this will lead to mass reduction in jobs, etc., overnight, I do believe that there are more value-added opportunities that we need to move ourselves towards, and some of the mundane repetitive tasks should be now done through AI, through computers and robotics. So I think that's a big part of each of us and our company as well, looking very closely at what are those mundane tasks that we can automate or use robots. And that's an exciting journey for us as well.
Thank you, Ankit, and thank you for those beautiful examples. So Bruno, moving to you, I would love to give you the floor. Again, I want to thank to all the panelists so far for their contribution. And it's my pleasure to invite Bruno Lunvin back to the floor to present the Network Readiness Index highlights for Europe. And after that, we're gonna have our reactions from the panelists. Bruno? You're mute.
Thank you, Carolina. Let me share my screen so we can follow on the slides.
And I ask the panelists to mute and turn off your videos if you don't mind.
Okay.
Yes, it's perfect.
Is that
yeah.
full screen? Great.
Yes.
So I'm introducing the results of the 2020 edition of the Network Readiness Index. The theme this year being accelerating digital transformation in a post-COVID global economy. And I will do that in the next 20 minutes by developing 4 points, just describing what NRI is about, indicating what the main results from the rankings are for this year, pointing at the way we tackle the theme of digital transformation, and finishing with an explanation of the key messages that emerge from this year's report. So starting with point number 1, what is NRI? NRI has been around for more than 20 years now. It's the key metrics at the core of NRI relate to how ICT can be used for development and competitiveness. So it's fairly broad, but fairly precise at the same time. Launched in 2021-22 by the World Economic Forum, it was then part of the Global Information Technology Report, also known as GITR. In 2019, the governance of the report was transferred from the World Economic Forum to Portulans Institute, and that was the opportunity to make the index, the model, and the report more reflective of current ICT issues and more geared towards the notion of future readiness. NRI 2020 has the privilege to welcome a new sponsor. We heard Ankit earlier from STL, who is an industry-leading integrator of digital networks. That's for the historical and institutional background. In terms of substance, the underlying principle behind the model of NRI 2020 is that we will need to go beyond technology. Our collective future, if we want to fully leverage the potential of digital transformation, requires that we combine technology on one side and people on the other side. And for that, we need the proper harmonious governance principles that the panel already discussed in the first part. The model is based on 4 pillars that reflect this philosophy. Technology is one of them, but people, governance, and impact are the other 3. All of those are described through some 60 indicators, so a pretty holistic approach to what we consider as network readiness. This model is not cast in stone. That is, it is there to evolve, to reflect the world economy and how we use technology and how we want to use technology. So we are always very eager for feedback from the users, whether in the public sector, private sector, individual citizens, experts, economists. All comments are always welcome, and we try to use them to improve the model year after year. So moving to the rankings, where the press and the media are typically after, these are the results of this year's report. 134 economies have been covered, and you see there the top 10. The gold, silver, and bronze medal go to Sweden, Denmark, and Singapore, respectively. 2 conclusions emanate immediately from these rankings. One is that high-income countries continue to dominate. So the digital divide issue is far from having dissipated. And these are the red dots on this diagram. Among the top 10, we have 8 European countries. So what has been mentioned before by several of the panelists is very clear. Europe is still very much in the lead in terms of NRI rankings, but altogether in terms of digital transformation in more than one respect. That should not be a reason for self-complacency. Clearly, there are areas where Europe is lagging. If we look at artificial intelligence, comparing the performance of Europe to that of the US or even China, and other areas still require further improvement. But that's a fact. If you just look at the top 10, 8 of the top 10 happen to be European countries. The way we look at the global picture is typically this one. Because we are, most of us economists, it's difficult to think about the world in its true 3 dimensions. So we try to reduce it to 2 dimensions, typically something we can intellectually grab. And typically, if we look at this kind of diagram, that is on the horizontal axis, you have the wealth of countries. You have the poor countries on the left, and the right is for the rich countries. And the vertical axis is the network readiness scores. So those who score low are at the bottom, and those who score high are towards the high end of the diagram. Correlation is obvious. If you are a wealthy country, typically you are better network ready than others. But going beyond this simple, undeniable fact, which can be defined as continuous digital divide, we look at several interesting components. One of them is the dynamics. The dynamics happens very much in the middle of the ranking. That is the blue group, lower middle income, and the orange group, upper middle income. This is where you have the majority of the population of the world. This is where you have the big blue bubble, which is India, and the big orange bubble, which is China. And what we see there? We see that both India and China are moving up the ladder at different pace, with different handicaps, with different challenges, but they are moving up. And both of them are above the polynomial regression line you see on this diagram, the black line. The black line indicates where your country should be if GDP per capita was the only way we had to anticipate the NRI performance. Both India and China and many other middle-income countries are actually above that line, which means that they are boxing above their category. They are boxing above their weight. They are doing better than what the GDP per capita would suggest. So this is a very encouraging sign and something that we like to deepen when we do NRI analysis. To do that, we try to go along the various pillars. And what we see is that the leadership in these pillars is also very revealing. There again, and this is the purpose of the red dots, we see Europe all over the place. The top 3 for technology are European countries, Switzerland, Sweden, Netherlands. 2 of the top 3 for the people pillar, 3 of the top 3 for governance, and 2 of the top 3 for impact. So Europe, again, is there. But we see countries like Korea and Singapore featuring very high. There is clearly something to be learned from emerging countries, from Asia and the Pacific in particular, in terms of these 2 pillars. One remarkable conclusion we can also draw from this simple diagram or table is that look at Sweden. Sweden is the world champion this year. They are the #1 in the NRI. And Sweden is not the top country in any of the 4 pillars. What does that tell us? And I will come back to that when describing the key messages. It tells us that to be a champion in network readiness, you need to have a high level performance in all pillars. It doesn't need to be the top performance, but it needs to be high in all pillars. That's something worth looking into when we try to see how digital transformation could work in countries at different levels of development. So if we look at the same performance by income group, I already said that, of course, the high-income economies are doing better. And this goes to the top 25%. If you look at the top 25% of the 134 countries covered by this year's NRI, you see that all of them, except one, are high-income economy. The pillars in which high-income economies dominate more strongly are technology. Typically, it's about infrastructure, it's about equipment, and governance. And governance has to do with the quality of regulation, with the type of environment that is brought about and around digital transformation. Again, if we look at the various groups, we see Europe very much present, even among the middle income with Bulgaria, Ukraine, Moldova, for instance. But the most interesting part is what happens in countries like Malaysia or Vietnam, which are outperforming everybody else, including China, in their respective income groups. That tells us a lot about the dynamics, especially when it comes to the dynamics that can be imprinted by the private sector in this kind of countries. Both Malaysia and Vietnam are heavily populated countries. So they are not facing small challenges. They have to move the whole economy up the ladder, and they chose to put a particular accent on digital, and that seems to work. So if we try to look at various regions, and the red square there already tells us the story I described earlier about Europe, we see that there are champions everywhere. And this is where most of the inspiration comes locally. Very few sub-Saharan African countries are going to look up at Singapore or Sweden to decide what they should do, but they will be inspired by the performance of Mauritius, South Africa, or Kenya, because they can relate not just culturally, but also developmentally. And they will look at the practical experience that has been gathered on the ground to achieve higher performance in network readiness. The same is true for every single region. I would go even as far as saying that regional rivalry work better than global rivalry. What I mean by that is that when we issue the rankings for Europe, if I speak to my colleagues in France, one of of course, their first question is, where is France ranking? But the next question is, are we above or below Germany? Same thing if you talk about the performance of Belgium. What is the performance of the Netherlands or Luxembourg? So it works in Arab states. Clearly, the rivalries and the race that exists between the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia is also reflected in NRI ranking. And this is where we use NRI to generate energy to entice further action on the ground. And without being cynical, that works well. So going back from Europe, we can, and we don't have the time to do it now, so I'm just flagging it very briefly, go a bit deeper and see whether the discrepancies we find in other regions. For instance, Asia Pacific is very dispersed in terms of performance, whether that exists also in region. As Paul mentioned earlier, we should not consider that the digital divide does not exist in Europe. And the examples that were mentioned are telling in that respect. So there's still work to be done in that area. And if we go beyond the European Union and we look at Bosnia and Herzegovina as an example, which is the lowest ranking country in the European region, there is still much that we can do to resolve that divide. In overall performance, clearly, Europe is ahead of the pack. It is the most network-ready region, given the methodology we use in NRI. It leads in all pillars and sub-pillars of the index. And as mentioned before, its strengths are the strengths of higher income countries. That is technology and governance, which could be one way to say we still have work to do in people, especially skills, educating those who can help us benefit from digital transformation, and of course on impact, especially in turning ideas and good startups into something that can work also for the European market and being developed in a way that has been they have been developing in Silicon Valley and other places. So since the theme of this year is digital transformation, we should go beyond just those rankings. What we're trying to do this year, which is unprecedented, is to accompany the report with digital transformation dialogues. So as Carolina mentioned before, we've developed these interviews and we are still carrying out these interviews. So it's a living product that is accompanying the report, which can be used and consulted through the Portulans website. And we will be continuing to gather this kind of insiders and outsiders views on what digital transformation mean and how COVID could influence it in the future. The key questions we wanted to raise about digital transformation are the following. Number one, how is digital transformation impacting global inequality? This redefinition of globalization can be helped or made more difficult by digital transformation and digitization. What is the current state of play? That was our first concern and question. The second one is digital transformation leading to better lives? That is, if digital transformation is just about more video surveillance or more smart cities that would be concerned more about technology than making people happier to live in cities, we may have been missing something somewhere. So this notion that was raised earlier by Chris about linking digital transformation to happiness and to better living, and to also an ability for younger generation to contribute, as Ankit mentioned before, are in our view critically important. And the last one is, which has to do with governance, is are we controlling technology or are we being controlled by technology? This is a concern which is rising because of the advent of ubiquitous artificial intelligence, but not just because of that. There is a general concern, which is also some kind of a backlash compared to the world in which we were living, let's say, in the early 2000, sorry, anticipating a bit too much. So altogether, the framework that is offered by NRI would help us to identify the way in which human aspects and technological aspects can be combined under this umbrella of a good shared global vision and the proper governance mechanisms. This we try to translate into key messages. So let me spend the last few minutes in describing what these key messages say for this year's report. Number one, digital transformation needs to be system-wide. So I need not insist too much on that, having mentioned the example of Sweden, of most European countries. If you want to be future ready, you need to work on all four pillars of the model. It's not just technology, it's human, it's governance, and it is impact. Message number two, digital transformation may create new forms of digital divide. We've been used to measuring digital divides through typically access to infrastructure, to cost of using digital services. What COVID has told us and what NRI shows is that there are new dimensions of digital divides that need to be taken into account. We've seen inequalities developed around the ability to work and contribute remotely, online. This is not just a question of ability to access infrastructure and to afford the equipment. It's also a matter of skills, it's a matter of mindset, it's a matter of being able to work in teams across cultural and national borders. Message number three, trust and security are central to successful digital transformation. We spoke already in the first part of this event about governance, about regulatory aspects. Clearly, cybersecurity has become a critical element of successful digital transformation. It's not just because trust will be necessary to enhance e-commerce. It is not just a question of encouraging people to release their personal data in a trusted environment. It's just also what we want to do about privacy. How much are we ready to risk in terms of developing the economic value of global networks? And Europe there is ahead of the pack. The protection, GDPR, privacy, etc., have been at the very high levels of concerns about digital transformation in Europe. The world is trying to find inspiration for what's happening or not happening in Europe. And this is something where further efforts are required that could be important, not just for Europe, but for the world as a whole. Message number 4, COVID has accelerated digital transformation. This has been already very much underlined in the panel, so I need not insist more on that. We have not seen the whole picture yet. It's going to accelerate the way in which not only we work, but also the way in which we use space. Ankit described the example of STL before. You know, the use of office space is just changing, and this has huge implication at a number of levels. Message number 5, education and reskilling are critically important if we want digital transformation to be not only successful, but sustainable. It will all be about jobs. It will all be about fighting massive employment, fighting the collapse of entire sectors of our economy that have been damaged by COVID. So helping population as a whole to reskill itself on a lifelong learning basis is critically important to ensure that digital transformation will not only be successful, but supported, encouraged by our societies. Message number 6, digital transformation can help accelerate the implementation of SDGs. We have a set of objectives which go beyond sustainable development. They're not just about climate change. They're about fighting poverty. They're about giving access to health, to education, to the world population that doesn't have access to those. The pursuit of SDGs is being damaged by COVID. Digital is one of the tools through which we can put the pursuit of SDGs back on track and accelerate their implementation. We have a host of examples where this is happening. These examples are on the ground. They need to be observed, they need to be measured, and they need to be scaled up. And the connection between NRI and SDGs is one of the new features of the revised NRI in which we believe strongly. Last but not least, message number 7, digital transformation can help rebuild global cooperation and redefine globalization. We've seen before COVID a collapse of multilateralism. We've seen a number of very big countries withdrawing from their international commitment regarding climate change and other areas in trade, in investment, in intellectual property. This should not be let happen, because if the world is not able to restore quickly a climate of trust in rebuilding global cooperation, we will not be able to survive the COVID crisis. We will not be able to fight the real crisis, which has not started yet, which is the economic and social crisis. So redefining globalization, going beyond nation states, involving cities, involving universities, private companies across national borders, is something that can be helped by digital transformation, because digital tools are the source of further and more active cooperation at intellectual, at cultural, and at economic levels. So these are the 7 key messages. Thank you for your attention. I encourage, of course, all of those in our audience who have not looked at the report to go to our website, play with the data. This is something which is not, again, cast in stone. It's made for simulation. It's made for further thinking. It's made for bringing new ideas and things we may have missed, and will help us make the report better in the years to come. Thank you. Back to you, Carolina.
Thank you so much, Bruno. Yes, if you don't mind, stop sharing your screen so we can go back to the...
Let me try to do that.
On the bottom of the Zoom.
Yeah, I'm in reduced view, so I don't have it anymore. I'll try to find it.
Okay, so I would love to invite our other panelists to come back and join me with your cameras on. You need to go to the Zoom window. There you go. Thank you, Bruno, so much. And Paul and Chris and Jackson and Kit, thank you for staying here with us. So I would love to go in order. I see you guys here in my screen. Paul, if I can ask you your reactions to some of the comments and numbers Bruno presented. And I would like to give you guys 3 minutes each, and then we can conclude the panel.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Carolina. By the way, the reaction is great. Thank you. I rather than commenting on it, I'd like to ask you a question, Bruno. You, in a rather interesting way, evoked the post-COVID world, what it was going to look like, in particular when we're dealing with the problem of mass unemployment. But one of the things I've been struck by is that so far we haven't gone there. And what I mean by that is we've had, what is it? I looked up the figures right before this call because I thought this might come up. GDP down almost 12% in the second quarter, down 4% in the first quarter. By any conceivable definition, that's a recession. We don't even view it in those terms anymore. Government debt in Europe, where we monitor these things very closely because of all the various governance mechanisms that use those figures as a benchmark, now 95% of GDP, way off any of the stability pact. And unemployment, because of the largesse, is held at around 8%. I'm just wondering if that's part of the trend that we're seeing, if we're not moving into a world where we see we're willing to tolerate larger levels of debt in order to sustain more employment. And I just was curious what you thought about this, because it's a very important developing situation. I mean, over the years, we've had a lot of discussion about basic income, and we're not quite there, but it would seem willy-nilly. But the logic behind that sort of thinking is very much where we're going with public policy at the moment. I just am curious how, in particular, given all this interesting data you sit on, what you think that post-COVID world might look like, and where the points of pressure might be in policy making and decisions.
Thank you, Paul. I think that would be a good topic for another event like this one. So let me give you the very short answer in 3 points. First, other studies we do, which are not NRI, they relate to the Global Talent Index, point at the fact that the world of work is changing. And this is pre-COVID. Sure. Okay? So clearly, we're not anywhere anymore in a world where people have one job for life. People are not just moving from shorter work cycles, but also working for different employers at the same time. So the free agent, and that will be a key component of how we look at employment in a post-COVID environment. The second point is that recovery packages, that is massive public debt, are clearly playing a very important role.
Sure.
That will not last forever. We're going to live with debt for a long time. That's the weight we push on future generation, but we're not looking at reimbursing those debt. I would say 25 years, they're just a ballpark figure. So that will remain critical. Let's not forget, and when the UK was leading the world, they had for about 20 years, 200% budget deficit. Okay? So it's not incompatible. We have to rethink the way we want to live on that. The third element is the shape of the recovery. We have an alphabet soup. We've been talking of U, V's, W's, etc. I think the two likely scenarios are the drunken square root and the K recovery. drunken square root is you have a V shape followed by something which is rather flat, but with variations. That is going to be part. We'll have a level of uncertainty remaining with us. The K recovery is more of a concern. The K means that some go up and some go down.
Go up and some go down. Yeah.
And that will create international tensions, especially on the labor scene. Sorry for these are very, very short answers to a very broad and exciting question that we have to address.
It was a great answer, and I'm going to steal the drunken square root from you, but with proper credit. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bruno. Jax, do you have some comments and reactions?
Yeah, I think, Bruno, you did a good job summarizing a wealth of data into the insight of the NRI. And I guess the three key takeaways on my side, and I would like you to comment on my comments, are the following. The very first one is that I like the way you presented in saying, look, you don't need to be a spike, you better be a well-rounded country to win. And that's what you say about Sweden. But I would add as well that what is quite fascinating in the ranking of being well-rounded and lead the pack is that a country like Sweden is not only leading the pack in digital transformation, is leading the pack, as we say, in some of the in the lead in terms of the countries with the most cohesive social inclusion, is the country where it's ahead of the curve when it comes to minorities and women leadership. It's a country that seems to have its own mind when it comes to cope with the COVID-19 crisis. So at least there is something genetic or transformative across all dimensions. And the theme I wanted to make a comment on is that digital is a marker of a transformation, but it's also, when you lead it, it's because you have a bulk of endowment capabilities and daring that makes this thing a virtuous cycle. And I'm quite convinced from what you have shown. The second comment is that, hey, you know what? Sweden is a very small country. And in one way, they could lead not because they are big, but because they're excellent, or at least they excel in many things. So we all talk about scaling and size. Again, I would love you to comment about the fact that not necessarily big is beautiful, but with density of effort and cohesiveness of effort between the public-private partnerships, and you name it, you can still win on the digital transformation. And last but not least, this is something you didn't talk too much about it, and I've tried to make it in my comments as well, is that at the end of the day, in an ecosystem, the responsibility of employment, at least today, still boils down to enterprise. And there are two types of enterprises. The very large one that hire a lot of people, but basically don't necessarily grow and shrink because of digital transformation. So they're not necessarily, they're responsible for the stability of jobs, not for the growing jobs. And then there are all the SMBs and the mid-market that basically use technology to transform, to create new business model, and usually are creating a lot of jobs. Now, if you look at all the countries there, we tend to talk too much about very low digital startup and large corporate. We're just missing a bit of the middle. Where do you think Sweden and the countries of Europe stand in terms of leadership, in terms of the small medium enterprise dynamics, or is there another country that will pump up in the ranking?
Thank you, Jacques. Yeah, again, very quickly, because this would be a very broad discussion. So I agree with every point that Jacques mentioned. Just a point about Sweden. I agree that clearly being a small country can be turned into an advantage. You have a more cohesive society, you can move more swiftly, you can be more agile. There's also one dimension that is key, a key ingredient in most small countries, is that they have no choice but be open economies. When you are big countries with a big domestic market, you can build things on your own. You can afford to be protectionist. You can afford to be nationalistic. If you are Sweden or Switzerland or Singapore, you have no choice. You have to be an open economy. And what we see in network readiness is that if you're an open economies, it's not just about being open to trade, being open to investment. It's being open to ideas. It's being open to cultures. It's being open to new ways of looking at the other world. And Sweden is one of the examples of a society that has been able to do that.
Thank you, Jackson. Thank you, Bruno. Chris, I would love to have your reactions. And we also have a question for Jackson, Bruno in the chat, but I'm going to come back to that in a second.
Sure. Look, I'm very focused on this question of what the Network Readiness Index for 2021 will show, because I think that countries and regions are making decisions now that will have a tremendous impact. And just based on the last few interventions, to me, it seems that the digital divide is almost like a leading indicator of other disparities and inequalities and divides within our societies. So, and COVID, who's sent us all home, some of us, our kids are able to easily do online school because of connectivity and sort of level of skills and infrastructure, and others can't. Some of us can do our jobs at home because we work in an online environment that was almost seamless transition from what we did before, while others are still exposed to the virus out in the real economy, facing it every day. And I think, you could track these divides, whether it's health outcomes or income inequality, and they would probably track with what the digital divisions that we've discussed are. And so it'll be interesting to see how country scores emerge in the next iteration. For Europe in particular, we talked about how the 750 billion euro stimulus is going to focus on green and on digital. There'll be sustainability and digital as sort of the pillars. And I think that I'm very interested to see if this has an impact on what the scores show us in the next NRI. And then the other thing, as we do a tour of the world, you see a lot of sort of this move toward regulation, trying to affect some sort of digital sovereignty or control of data flows, or it's a more dramatic description of splinter nets and so forth. And again, these are regulatory and policy decisions that I think will have a direct impact on how countries rise or fall in the future next index. I will be looking for that closely. And then, finally, just on a more personal level, I am one of these avowed globalists, right? I sort of grew up and did my education with all those institutions like Bruno's that are seeking to foster trust and collaboration across borders and around the world. And I find in this digital virtual environment, it's the ability to forge the kind of relationships that you need to solve problems and get work done. It happens differently now, and I'll be interested to see again, which I think will probably be more based on culture, maybe some of the openness that Bruno discussed, but the economies that really are able to build traction and virtually no travel for as long as this pandemic lasts. So looking forward to the next iteration and very delighted to see the results, and certainly for the European region for this iteration. So thanks.
Thank you, Chris. And Ankit, if I may ask you your final comments, and then I'm going to move to the question from the audience.
I think without a doubt, really comprehensive reports. Really appreciate the work done to create this NRI. I think what I particularly thought was, a very simple but pretty powerful representation was that figure of the NRI versus GDP per capita mapped in the 2D. And I think that's something, it is very easily, understandable, very easily, people are able to understand the impact of it. So I think that's something that I thought is very useful. I'm personally already thinking of how I can present this document and this particular chart to various regulators, including in India, where they would find such data very useful. So I think that's one part of it. I agree with what Chris said. I think particularly looking at Europe, I think the 750 billion euro recovery fund will play an important impact. We're already hearing a lot of talk about it, especially in countries that have been significantly impacted by the COVID, like Italy, France, UK, to a certain extent. So I certainly believe that you will see some of that impact come into either interest-free loans or subsidies, or just government investment in building the digital infrastructure. So I think that will then definitely have an impact in the index for the next few years, in my own view. I think the other part of the index, what I really appreciated is just takes a very holistic view of what is readiness, and I think that for me is very useful. Is also very powerful, because you cannot look at this unidimensionally anymore, and I think that's even more relevant today as we're all talking in this kind of COVID and post-COVID era. So I think these are some of the elements that I found particularly useful. I certainly believe that this is a report that can be and will be shared and used widely. And I will also personally and through STL ensure that this reaches some important stakeholders both in India and globally.
Thank you, Ankit, and thank for all the attendance. So I have a question here for Jax and Bruno. How do you see the EU startups competing with the rest of the world in the context of the post-COVID world? Most unicorns are still in the US, China, and now India. So to you, Bruno.
Unless Jacques wants to take the first one. I can. Okay.
Okay, and you're gonna jump on me. A few simple points on the questions. I think it really depends the way you look again at the data. But my perspective is the following. First, unicorn is what they are, but they represent a very small number of companies, to be quite honest. So I understand that it's a good matrix to look at, but again, they're not necessarily are representative of the full perspective of entrepreneurship. Point number two, if you look at the startup world, I think, and you look at the ecosystem, again, that's the point that the NRI has alluded to. The density, except Silicon Valley, which is exceptional and is possibly confirms the rules, I would say, is that Europe is actually, in terms of density of promising startup. If you take Sweden, if you take Amsterdam, if you take even Madrid, Paris, Berlin, and a few more tailored, like in security, Romania and the like, they are competing very well with most of the cities in the US. And but it takes time, simply because the US got to get those platforms that are much more B2C centric, and Europe is much more specialized into the B2B space, where the B2B space is lagging the B2C. So that's why I think there's a time lag effect that will happen. And last but not least, I want to say on the entrepreneurships as well. Yes, indeed, we see China coming out, but China is a strategy of large support from the domestic market to come international, with a protection of the domestic market. Is very much linked to the States. And by the way, they have a strategy of patenting, especially from the local market, as a way to protect the way they could go international. If you look at the US has been obviously less linked to the States, even if the early waves was obviously linked to commission to the States. And on top of that, the way they impose their business model is de facto to open source by de facto standards by using their own system. And Europe is in between. But I also argue that Europe in the future, if I look at AI, I'm amazed as part of my job, as part of the VC world, I'm just amazed to see the amount of quality thinker and a lot of entrepreneurship that is starting to build in Europe. And if I look at the data from the entrepreneurship density, we see the numbers going up in Europe where they're going down in the US. And that's a fascinating story where we see that the mobility as well as the entrepreneurship level is actually come out quite nicely in Europe, where in the US, I think it has peaked, at least when it comes to the very large cities like New York or even the Silicon Valley. And one of the reasons is very simple. If you look at Silicon Valley and if you look at who is driving this kind of entrepreneurship, it happened to be the Chinese diaspora or the Indian diaspora. And these guys now are back into their own countries and develop the ecosystem from China or from India. And the small Europeans that basically made it as well to Silicon Valley are coming back and find ecosystem talents and all the kind of different pillars of the NRI to be much more self-fulfilling and much more stable in Europe than possibly in the US. So I'm still an optimist that Europe has possibly lost the war, is a bit in the catch-up mode, but can leapfrog and do something quite excellent in the future.
Yes, I have very little to add. I totally agree with what Jacques just said. I was about to mention the fact relating to openness, that we should not forget that the majority of the startups created in Silicon Valley are created by non-US citizens. This has been there since the creation of Silicon Valley. It is still very much there today, especially Chinese and Indian leaders have played very important roles in that respect. And this is what we see translating in the emergence of unicorns in China and India. And it's a very encouraging sign. As far as Europe is concerned, there is also a more diffuse kind of economic tissue. Another product which is carried out with the label of Portulans is the Global Innovation Index that was released on 2nd September. The theme this year was on who will finance innovation. So we look very closely at the way venture capitalists in particular had been behaving after the crisis of 2008, 2009, and in the crisis of 2020. And we see similarities and dissimilarities. One thing is clear, is that support for innovation will not diminish. So there will be money, public and private, to continue innovation. It may be more polarized than it has been in the future. We've seen 2 or 3 years ago the emergence of fintech. We're going to see health tech as leading the pack in the new unicorns. But that's just one facet. The thing is that innovation financing is there to stay, and it will be more spread at the surface of the globe than it has ever been before, which is good news.
Thank you, Bruno. So I would love to conclude the panel today. First, for saying thank you to all our panelists, and also recognize again the great partnership with ICANN and STL. And I think that's all for now. For all those present here, we're gonna publish a recap of this panel, probably by tomorrow with the video. So I welcome you to share with your networks. So thank you so much, everybody. And if you don't mind, let's just smile for the camera for a second. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day, rest of your day. Bye-bye.